Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening for this really important conversation. I know there's a lot going on, so we appreciate that you are taking time out of your evening to think about mapping toward racial equity. This is a complex subject, but it's certainly one that we need to talk about, we need to understand, and we need to advocate on this issue. Real solutions will require collaboration by legal experts, geographers, statisticians, grassroots organizers, and informed, determined citizens from every demographic. What we've seen in the last year or so is that having experts working on their own is not enough. Having lawyers and great public interest law centers is not enough. We need to have informed people who are willing to advocate, who are willing to be persistent and determined to ask for a legislature, a government that works for all of us. And that's our goal tonight, is to make sure that we have a legislature that works for everybody, every community, every demographic in our state. We're asking the Legislative Reapportionment Commission to dedicate time to this issue with testimony from experts and community leaders, as we're doing tonight, so that commissioners and the broader public can understand the challenges, the opportunities, and the great need to address this issue with fair maps for the next decade. We've submitted testimony to that effect. We invite everybody who's here tonight to submit testimony asking for them to hold a hearing about racial equity. All who registered will receive an email sometime later this week with links to ways to advocate and submit testimony. We won't spend time on that this evening. We've certainly talked about giving testimony in other meetings in recent months. And we have quite a bit about that on our website, but we will share links to information on that in the email we send. We will also send a link to the recording of this evening's forum. It will be on YouTube as soon as we can get it there in the next day or two. We have a full agenda, so Q&A time may be limited, but please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function on Zoom rather than in chat, so that people can see the questions and can vote them up, vote them down. It allows us to kind of dismiss questions once we've answered them. Also allows our panelists, if there's an easy question that they can answer in the Q&A function, they're free to do that as well. I'll introduce folks as we go along. We've got a really interesting mix of folks tonight. I am planning to learn a lot. I am planning to take notes. I will not be doing much talking at all, except to introduce folks, because this is plenty to learn, plenty to think about. We're going to start with Ben Geffen, who is a longtime friend of Fair Districts PA. He was at our first formation meeting back in January of 2016, and the Public Interest Law Center has been a good friend and advisor to us in our work along the way. Ben has been a staff attorney with the Public Interest Law Center for a number of years, and he was the lead attorney in the League of Women Voters redistricting lawsuit in 2017, 2018, the case that found our gerrymandered congressional districts unlawful and resulted in the new congressional map that we have enjoyed in 2018 and 2020. He also has played a major role in other lawsuits protecting the rights of Pennsylvania voters and communities, and we are really appreciative that he's here tonight just to tell us a little bit about the kind of the legal framework for this conversation that we are going to be having. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are as interested and as concerned about this issue as we are. So I want to give just a little background. I think the next few speakers are going to be much more interesting than I am, because they're going to talk about where the rubber meets the road in Pennsylvania and how redistricting and equity intersect in this state. But I'm just going to give a little bit of background on an important legal issue, which is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a lot of people heard about a US Supreme Court case back in 2013, the Shelby County case that knocked out a big part of the Voting Rights Act. It didn't completely eliminate the Voting Rights Act, though. It found that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and that's also Section 5, were unconstitutional. Those were the portions that required certain jurisdictions, mostly southern states, to get pre-clearance from the federal government before changing voting rules and redistricting. It didn't apply to Pennsylvania, though, those parts of the law. And the Supreme Court decision did not eliminate another part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the part I'm going to talk about tonight. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, among other things, prohibits racially discriminatory voting legislation that will dilute the votes of members of minority communities. And what that means in the redistricting context specifically is that in certain circumstances, states may be required to ensure that there are a certain number of districts where members of racial or ethnic minorities have an opportunity to elect representatives from their communities. And the reason for this is one of the many ways that Jim Crow worked was, you can imagine a southern state that has, let's say, 70% white and 30% black population. Lo and behold, they would draw 10 districts. Each district had 70% white, 30% black inhabitants, and you'd end up with a 100% white, 0% black delegation. So that's the basic way that racial gerrymandering was used to freeze out Black communities from ever attaining a majority or ever getting to elect a Black representative. So this has been litigated a lot, usually in southern states, but in I think 1980, the US Supreme Court said that the Voting Rights Act did not require the creation of majority minority districts. And Congress responded in 1982, and actually President Reagan signed this bill that amended the Voting Rights Act to its current form of Section 2 that requires the creation of what are known as either opportunity districts, you see that term sometimes, or majority minority districts when states draw new lines, whether it's congressional lines or state legislative lines. There has been a ton of litigation. Every decade, there are a bunch of cases filed in federal court, almost always from southern states, that go up to the US Supreme Court. And when you read through all of those precedents and try to make sense of them, it's bewildering. The courts come out this way on some and that way on others. It's very hard to draw a straight line through all those cases. It's very hard to predict exactly how the court might rule in a future situation. But I can give just a little bit of an outline about how these precedents work. So the kind of foundational case since the voting rights amendments were passed was in 1986, a case called Thornburg v. Jingles, which is a US Supreme Court case that set out a three-part test for claims that a districting map was drawn in a way that didn't create opportunities for members of minority groups to elect representatives from their communities. First of all, if you're a plaintiff and you're making that claim and you're suing and you want to challenge the map, you have to show that this minority group is big enough and compact enough that you could draw a district where the members of that group would form a majority of the voters. You have to show that it's a politically cohesive group, meaning that members of that group tend to vote mostly the same way. And you have to show that that there would be enough voting strength, given the first two factors, that they could actually elect representatives from their community. So that's the basic standard. Now, what's kind of weird is there's this like Goldilocks problem, because on the one hand, a districting plan like that one I said before, where there are 10 districts and they're all 70% white, that's like a pot of porridge that's too cold. It doesn't give any opportunities for Black voters to form a majority in any district, doesn't give any chance for there to be even a single Black representative elected. The pot of porridge can get too hot also. And that happens when there is packing of Black voters. And it doesn't have to be Black voters. It can be other racial or ethnic minority groups. But I'm just using Black voters because that's where most of the litigation has happened. So the first one I mentioned, this 70-30, 10 districts or 70-30, that would be where you've cracked the Black vote. You could also pack the Black vote. Let's say you drew a wiggly squiggly district that was designed to make one district that's like 98% Black, so that you would have one district where virtually all the Black voters lived. So then you might end up with 9 majority white districts and 1 majority Black district. So that's like an overly aggressive creation of a majority minority district. It's also designed to make it hard for Black voters to elect a proportional number of representatives. And so in the 1990s, the US Supreme Court held a few cases about that issue and said that that can violate the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, if there are districts that are drawn predominantly on the basis of race. So the best map is going to fit into that Goldilocks zone between cracked and packed. You're going to have, in my imaginary state here, your Goldilocks zone, you're going to have probably 3 majority minority districts in that state. You're not going to have any one district that's like almost entirely Black, but you're going to have 3 districts where there's a reasonable chance for Black voters to elect a member of their community. And so that would be the Goldilocks solution. Again, though, this continues to get litigated. There were a couple cases just in the last decade or so. In 2009, there was a case called Bartlett v. Strickland, where the US Supreme Court said that, it talked about what are called crossover voters. So a crossover voter in this example would be like a white person who was happy to vote for Black candidates, which isn't always the case in certain parts of our country, but there are certainly crossover voters. I think Philadelphia probably has a lot of crossover voters. We have a lot of white voters who vote for Black candidates and Black voters who vote for white candidates. We've actually had kind of like an alternating pattern of Black and white mayors in Philadelphia for many years, for example. But that's a very different voting pattern from what you might see in other parts of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court in 2009 said that it doesn't count as Section 2 does not require states to draw districts that are minority Black, but with enough crossover voters that it could form a majority. So, and sorry, this all gets really technical really fast. So I'm going to try to not get too much into the weeds here. But there's an unresolved question, hasn't been litigated yet in the US Supreme Court. I wouldn't be surprised to see it come up this cycle, which is, well, what about districts that have a couple of different minority groups? Let's say you have a district that's like 45% Black and 10% Latino, for example. How does that factor in as a majority minority district? I think some of the lower courts have come out different ways on that, and that's an interesting issue we may see the US Supreme Court weighing in on in the next year or so. Most recent US Supreme Court decision on this, I believe, was Cooper v. Harris in 2017, which struck down a congressional map in North Carolina on the grounds that the Republicans there who drew the map drew a couple of packed Black districts and kind of cynically said, oh, well, the Voting Rights Act required us to draw the districts that way. And the court kind of called BS on that and said, no, that was a racial gerrymander that violated the Constitution. And they struck down that map. And what's interesting is, a lot of you have probably heard this famous quote. So that was in 2017. So they had to draw a new map for 2018. And the North Carolina legislature drew a map that was very heavily gerrymandered, again, this time in favor of Republicans. And David Lewis, now a federal prisoner, but at the time a state legislative leader in North Carolina, famously said that, well, we drew a map that would have 10 Democratic seats and 10 Republican seats and 3 Democratic seats. And the reason we did it that way is we didn't think it was possible to draw a map with 11 Republican and 2 Democratic seats. So on the one hand, that was a really cynical admission that they were deliberately doing a partisan gerrymander. But on the other hand, I think the reason that he said that was he wanted to say, oh, no, we're not discriminating against all those voters because they're Black. We're discriminating against them because they're Democrats. So he was trying to insulate that map from the US Supreme Court knocking it out again on the grounds that it was a partisan gerrymander, not a racial gerrymander. And it worked. The US Supreme Court, a couple of years later, overruled a lower court decision and said that in the North Carolina case that partisan gerrymandering cannot be litigated under the Constitution. Of course, North Carolina, that map later got knocked out in state court, but that's a whole other story for a whole other day. Finally, I just want to mention that, and you'll probably hear some of the later speakers talk about this. I think this exactly how to draw maps under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act remains very controversial, and it's not just Democrats or not just Republicans who consider it controversial. I think there's a lot of antipathy from the Republican Party toward Section 2 because of a concern that it is, I think, that party, and I'm trying to get very nonpartisan here, but Republican Party, a lot of its more vocal people tend to like to say that we live in a colorblind legal regime and we should just pretend that race doesn't exist whenever we do anything. And I think on the Democratic side, there are some people have strong feelings about it one way and some another way. There are those who think that it is intentionally drawing Section 2 districts is a vital way to account for historic disenfranchisement and segregation, and it's a way to integrate our elected representatives. I think there are other people who believe that the term you hear sometimes is an unholy alliance, that this has created this bizarre partnership between Black elected officials who want safe seats and Republicans who want to minimize Democratic voting strength, and that essentially that by drawing majority minority districts, it on the whole means that there are more Republican seats overall. Again, I'm not trying to weigh in on this debate one way or the other, but those are just kind of some of the terms of the debate. And the last thing I want to say, and then I will quit yakking, is that almost all of the lawsuits over the years about Section 2 have happened in the South. There has never in Pennsylvania, and under the modern Voting Rights Act, been a redistricting lawsuit that squarely focused on the Section 2 issue. There have been a couple lawsuits where it was kind of glancingly addressed, but it's never been the centerpiece of any redistricting litigation in Pennsylvania. Our political geography looks a little different from that of a southern state in terms of how Black voters and members of other racial ethnic minorities are concentrated, in terms of voting patterns, in terms of the willingness of voters in different parts of the state to cross over and vote for members of other groups and so on. So the facts on the ground are pretty different in Pennsylvania. So if this were to play out in litigation, it's like extra double hard to predict how exactly it would go in this state, just because there really are no precedents. So it's kind of a big question mark, a big mystery out there, but it's something that we may see coming up in the next couple of years. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ben. There was a small question that was answered. Maybe you could quickly answer this. Did yesterday's resolution on the LRC resolution to exempt reassignment of inmates with minimum sentences beyond 10 years back into their community of origin violate the VRA?
Yeah, so when talking about prison gerrymandering, I think there is an argument that could be made under Section 2. I think the stronger legal argument about why prison gerrymandering is unconstitutional is that it violates the one person, one vote rule. That's a little different from the Section 2 issue. So it's the idea is that prisoners are really, as a legal matter, residents of their hometowns, not their cells. And so when you count them at their cells and you draw bigger districts in communities that happen to be home to a prison, that is a malapportionment that violates the one person, one vote rule. So I don't think it's quite the same issue. And just I'll editorialize for 2 seconds and then I'll really stop talking, which is that I was really disappointed yesterday when the LRC made that vote, but I don't think anyone should lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that they voted in favor of adjusting inmate addresses for the first time ever. The 2 carve-outs that are now in effect for lifers and now for people serving 10+ year sentences, that affects about 15% of state prisoners, but 85% of state prisoners are now going to be reassigned to their home addresses. That's about 40,000 people. That's about 2/3 of a state house seat. Overall, I think it's terrific. I would rather we were at 100% than 85%, but 85% is fantastic. And the glass is 85% full. It's not half empty.
Thank you, Ben. We're going to move on. I do want to just give you a quick preview of where we're going this evening. We had Ben kind of give us the legal framework. We're going to hear from Professor Chris Fowler from Penn State University, who's going to give us a little bit of the geographic statistical framework statewide. And then we're going to have two case studies. We're going to have some folks from Pittsburgh talk a little bit about how this plays out in the African-American community in Pittsburgh. Then we're going to have some folks from Philly and from the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund talk about the Latino community in Philadelphia and kind of parse out some of what Ben was talking about with regard to numbers, compact populations, how we figure out, can you map for those communities? So we've got plenty of we're going to get more and more granular as we go through the evening. I do also want to just call attention to a really good comment from Representative Rabb, and we thank him for joining us this evening, which is the language that we use surrounding these communities. We understand that minority is an increasingly inaccurate definition in some arenas, and it's not always helpful. In the legal world right now, that's the terminology we have. So when Ben talks about majority minority districts or minority populations, he is talking in a legal framework. And this evening is going to be kind of challenging because we're bouncing back and forth among those. So I ask you to be generous and gracious in your understanding of how we use language. There's different ways. BIPOC is one, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color. We can talk about Black and Brown communities. But in the legal framework, we're talking about minority communities. So be gracious. We're all thinking about our language as we go. And we all want the same thing. The terminology we use might not always be exactly what your preference would be, but we're walking between a number of different worlds as we try to sort this out. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Chris Fowler. As I said, he's professor of geography at Penn State University. His work examines the way geographic boundaries shape outcomes. His focus is on the intersection between geography and racial and economic inequality. And I have to say that the whole question of mapping communities where people live is a big part of this, and why they live where they live often has to do with historic injustice. And that will come up as we go through the evening. He was an advisor in our Fair Districts PA LACRA Values Mapping Competition, had some really valuable insights as we worked our way through that. And he was appointed last week as one of the 6 advisors on Governor Wolf's Redistricting Advisory Council. So we're very happy to have Chris with us. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Carol, and thanks you all for taking time out of your evening to be here. So I have a lot to learn in this area, and I think one of the things to take forward, and I'm really very interested in hearing what the subsequent panelists have to say. One of the things to take forward is, and I think Ben hinted at this as well, is we don't really know how this all works in Pennsylvania. And that's sort of, we know that racial gerrymanders are illegal unless they're done in support of the Voting Rights Act. But as Ben said, because of crossover voting and some other things that I'm going to touch on tonight, we don't really know if Pennsylvania meets the standards for a VRA district. It currently has one, but it's not clear that it's one that's triggered by the actual conditions of the Voting Rights Act so much as just a district of convenience. And so because it hasn't actually been made clear that there is a VRA district, we can't actually use race as the predominant reason we draw lines. We can't say we're drawing our lines here because of race. We're moving people in or out of this district because of race. That's actually illegal. So there's a real tension here, which is how do you increase representation for Black and Brown communities in Pennsylvania most efficiently? And so much is uncertain that I think what we really have to fall back on is local knowledge and local communities. And so if there's one theme that's going to run through everything I would like you all to take with you into your activism, is use your knowledge to tell the people who are drawing the map where the lines should be. What is your community? And one of the things that we have to be careful about, and this is something that I'm struggling with a lot on this commission that I'm just joined with the governor and a number of experts in this area is how do we do this without triggering a Supreme Court review? Because it's almost certainly not going to be a good thing if Pennsylvania's map gets reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's not a desirable outcome. So how do we make a defensible map that has the happy outcome of increasing Black and brown community representation? And one of the answers to that is we probably can't use race as a predominant way of putting it. One thing I want to point out is that often the way the VRA has been interpreted, it is to create as the term majority-minority district. That's 50% plus one district. And one of the things we can see in the data, this is from the 116th or 115th Congress, every district but two that had at least 37% Black voting age population elected someone who became a member of the Black Congressional Caucus. So the problem with this data is there weren't a lot of districts around that 35 to 42% line in the South. In fact, there were none. And so one of the things we don't really know, we don't have enough data to understand, is this number, and I'm guilty of tossing it around myself. This threshold probably works better than 50%, certainly probably applies in Pennsylvania, but we have to be careful. Ben talked about this, the porridge is too hot, porridge is too cold. Probably 50% is too hot in Pennsylvania, but it might be exactly hot enough in Mississippi. I don't know. And one of the issues there is because districts don't get drawn across this entire spectrum with the geographic contexts that vary as much as they vary in this country, we don't really have an answer. But as we're thinking about representation, if you're trying to advocate for a particular kind of map, a map that has somewhere in the high 30s is in Pennsylvania, particularly in the Philadelphia range, is almost certainly going to elect, at least on a regular basis, elect Black representatives, probably. So that's something to look for. And if you see something way up there, high 50s, there's probably a reason for that. Now, it's not totally clear to me what the actual geographic dispersion of people that would maximize representation in this state actually is. We just don't know. And in part, it's because we've never had a process that gave us anything like a chance to see what good maps would produce. If we were trying to increase representation, we would produce very different maps, but we don't know how effective they would be because we've never had good maps. And so part of what we have to bring to this process is, a lot of attention so that if it's not working, we know it's not working and we can pass that information on to the next round, that this is a slow process. And hopefully 85% of inmates being counted, maybe that'll be, people start saying, actually, that's how it should be. That's fair. Maybe next time we'll get 100%. I don't know. But this is a process, and this is where I think it's heading. So the census has another problem that I was asked to talk on some of the statistical parts of this. On the census form, it is possible to identify as multiracial. And for a number of reasons, there are 225% as many multiracial people in Pennsylvania in 2020 as there were in 2010. So it went from about little under 3% to 6% of the population. A lot of those are the children of multiracial households, but there's also a big chunk of those people who formerly identified as Black alone. And one of the things that's interesting is we don't have any supporting evidence to suggest that people who identify as multiracial vote cohesively in a block with people who identify as Black alone. Okay? And because we don't have the evidence that they vote consistently, we don't meet the standard for one of the standards for VRA. So traditionally, people who identified as multiracial could not be counted for the purposes of identifying the need for a VRA district or identifying whether that need was met. Now, the Department of Justice has just put out a new guideline suggesting that multiracial should now be available to be counted as part of these VRA districts, but that hasn't been tested in court. And this is a big unknown as to whether, how to treat this population. And one of the things that mappers around the country are finding is that there were a lot of 50% plus one districts that are now 47% Black voting age population districts. And so, in Texas, where the VRA standard really needs to be met and where a lot of shenanigans are going on, it's really unclear how that's going to play out. Virginia is another place where this is going to be troubling. So on the one hand, it's pretty exciting. I think one of the things we see here is a cultural shift where people want to identify as multiracial, where sort of different kinds of backgrounds are becoming sort of culturally more accepted, and it's pretty cool to see what that sort of suggests about diversity and sort of the social construction of race in this country. So that's on one hand, there's some pretty promising stuff, but that's going to make a real hash of figuring out what race means in Pennsylvania this time around. So the census also introduced what this census deputy director calls cutting-edge privacy protections for 2020. And as a statistician, I can tell you it is a complete train wreck for us, in part because what they did is they've created a synthetic population. So the people who are being counted aren't real people. They're meant to look like real people when you add them all up, but there is no individual person truth. And one of the things that happens when the census does this little magic hand waving is that they see the actual number of people in a census block, which is a really small geographic unit, and say that number is 4. Okay, there's 4 people who really live there. Well, they decide to adjust that number to make it noisy, so we don't know exactly how many people there are. And so they randomly pull, and it's going to be somewhere between plus or minus 10 or 12 people, something like that. And so sometimes that 4 people becomes 16 people, and sometimes it becomes -8 people. And when it becomes -8 people, that creates a real problem, because you can't say there are -8 people here, because no one would believe that. So the census then pushes that from -8 up to 0. But then they have to find 8 people from somewhere else to fill that gap. And when they do that over and over and over and over again, what ends up happening is places where very few Black people live, communities that have a very small number of ethno-racial groups that have small numbers. So multiracial is one, Native American, in parts of Pennsylvania, certainly Hispanic is going to count in this way. These groups are systematically, if they get a high number, they get bumped way up. And so we see big growth, really large growth of Black populations in places that had very few Black people in them before. And what happens is they almost systematically take those people who were sort of disappeared, come out of places that had a lot of Black people. So over an entire city, you see Black communities showing up as much smaller than expected in places that have traditionally been very, very Black, and Black people showing up in much larger than expected numbers in places that traditionally have had almost no Black people in them. And that's a systematic bias. And at the scale of a congressional district, it probably washes out most of the time. These differences tend to sort of average out to nothing. But when we're looking at a state house district, when we're looking at the edges of a district, there's a lot there that's really, really kind of dodgy. So Carol also asked me to talk about the historic political geographic patterns, and I want to talk about that for just a second. One of the best ways we judge the fairness of maps in the present day, the statistical practice, is to compare a map that's presented to us with a whole series of randomly drawn maps. And we can look at the properties of all those randomly drawn maps. And if we compare the map we have, the map the legislature gives us, with all those randomly drawn maps, If our map looks just like their map, then it's probably a good map. If our map looks really different from their map, our map is probably not a good map. And this is a pretty nice way to sort of put some math behind, is that gerrymandered or not? The problem is, it assumes that a random map is a fair map. It takes as given the residential settlement patterns of the state and says, okay, this is natural, this is normal, this is how the world is. And what happens there is you get a bias. A random map in Pennsylvania is going to typically provide more elected representatives for Republicans than for Democrats, given the vote share that Republicans muster in this state. And that's because Democrats tend to be highly clustered in urban areas. And so a lot of political scientists take this as normal. This is just how settlement is. This is how geography is. And one of the things I think we have to remember is that people are settled in particular places for very specific reasons. And some of those have to do with who bought a house where, but a lot of those had to do with who was able to buy a house where. And so I've got here on the right, this is one of the famous Hulk maps that was associated with the redlining of, in this case I have Philadelphia up there, I think. No, did I grab Pittsburgh? I can't remember. Sorry, I can't really see it on my screen. It's really small. The point of it, though, is the patterns we see today aren't natural. They're not random. And in particular, where they emerge from systematic racism, that's got to be a problem, and that's got to be something we think about. So the reason to talk about this is to start out with identifying where our communities are, why they're there, and figuring out what we can do to gain representation from them. But what all of this means, all of the slides I presented to you should tell you, is that you have to advocate from the perspective of local knowledge. You have to say, the people in my community need this, okay? If you try and do it in the big picture, there's too much uncertainty. There's too much uncertainty about whether we need a voting rights, a VRA district. There's too much uncertainty about what a normal map looks like. There's too much uncertainty about where Black and brown communities actually are because of the way they've been moved around by the census. And so what's really needed is lots of advocates, people who can say, this is my community, don't split me from there. I want this, make me heard. And that's really, I think, more than enough of listening to me.
Thank you so much, Chris. Gives us some good backstory, some good overview, and we're going to go now a little bit more granular. We're going to talk about Pittsburgh and look at some of these issues as they play out in a particular community. So we have with us this evening Tonya Farrow-Chestnut. She is the data and senior research analyst at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She earned a PhD in urban and regional studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So she has seen this in the Southern context, and she brings experience in redistricting as a potential policy solution to address systemic racism. Before we go, yes, we had one of our next people had been knocked off, so it looks like he's back. Evans Moore is a voting rights trainer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he's been a community organizer in Pittsburgh for over 20 years and has looked at representation for his community there from a number of different angles. I am really grateful to him for helping pull this forum together. He and I talked early about what this could be. And I also appreciate his deep experience with his community in Western Pennsylvania. He was the founder of the Pittsburgh Interfaith Impact Network, which has won major justice campaigns at the intersection of geography, transit, housing, and racial equity. So Tonya and Evans are going to give us a little bit of a case study on this issue in Pittsburgh. We have never had an African-American senator from Pittsburgh, although the numbers are there to support that. They're going to talk about House districts, take a look at what it would take to get a Black senator from Pittsburgh, and share a little bit about why it's so incredibly important that communities weigh in as these maps are drawn. So Tonya and Evans, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Carol.
right. Share my screen here. All right. So we appreciate being able to join you tonight. Tonight, like Carol said, we're going to explain current Pittsburgh House districts through our conversation. And even though they may look a little funny, how they actually serve the minority community well, and the fact that some of them may actually be losing Black population. Suggests ways that the city could be mapped to provide for a majority minority Senate district. And we're going to model that through an interaction between a mapper and a community member, because Tonya's a mapper and I actually live in Pittsburgh. And so we'll give you a demonstration of what that conversation could look like. So just really quickly, a fair district should protect communities of interest, even though Pennsylvania doesn't have any specific law that calls for that. But a community of interest is a population with longstanding shared cultural, historical, and demographic or economic interest. And so they should be protected in this redistricting process. And it'll make sense to you why I'm lifting that up now as we go forward in our conversation. As an organization, LDF's redistricting priorities include having equal population and specifically protecting the interests of communities of color. And so right now I'm going to turn it over to Tonya to talk about majority minority districts as we move forward in our presentation.
Thank you, Evans. And as Chris alluded to, and certainly Ben in their respective discussions, majority minority districts take on these sort of characteristics. And so we, of course, are sensitive to the language, but districts where majority is comprised of people of color primarily is what we're referring to. So in the legal sense, we're talking about minority populations. Usually provides the opportunity for minority voters to elect their candidates of choice, even when white voters vote as a bloc for their own preferred candidates. And so I am used to working in the South, and so this language comes from polarized voting, and where we see that often is the case. And that may be somewhat different in the Northeast, and in particular, Allegheny County. And so majority minority districts, as it's referred to, is a remedy required by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act when a compact community of color that could form a majority in a single member district, for example, has experienced some form of dilution of their vote, right? So what we're trying to achieve is 50% Black voters in a district. I understand that is uncharacteristic, perhaps, as a voting rights solution in terms of the districts we're concerned about in Western Pennsylvania. However, it is important that we understand what the VRA protects. And so if we are trying to achieve a district where Black voters in particular, because we are looking at this from a racial lens, can elect and can participate and elect candidates that represent their interests, that is what our objective is. Okay, Evans.
So really quickly, just taking a quick look, we're going to look at some districts at the House level and look at the way they're drawn. In order to understand how the Black population was dispersed in Pittsburgh, you have to kind of go back to some public policy decisions that were made. So just really quickly, the Hill District is a prime example of an African-American community that was impacted by public policy and caused the disbursement of Black voters or Black citizens across the city. And so this picture represents the historical Bethel AME Church, which was demolished in a section of the city formerly called Little Haiti, which was cleared to build a civic arena. This was done under what I will say is the guise of urban renewal. In reality, what we know was really going on was that This was an effort to separate a majority Black community from a majority white downtown business district. And so there were decisions like this made all over the city of Pittsburgh in public housing development patterns, where public housing were placed in isolated places in the city of Pittsburgh, caused this weird disbursement of Black population in the city.
And so, as was referred to by Chris, this is what, as a geographer, we refer to as a Sanborn fire map, circa turn of the century, early 1900s. And so the red actually represents hazardous areas. And so, as we're familiar with Pittsburgh, and Evans did a great job in trying to educate me on the particulars and settlement patterns of Pittsburgh, you know, during the early part of the century, certainly there were structural impediments, there were barriers, systematic barriers, racism that is responsible for the patterns of settlement. And so this is how we understand where populations are and the historical patterns that explain why Black communities in particular live. Okay, Evans. So we're going to move into our case study in geographic racism and some potential remedies. So we don't have any answers. So I just want to offer that. We're not here to necessarily provide solutions, but actually to help illuminate the kinds of engagement that would hopefully lead to solutions and strategies. And so what we hope to do is to first talk about the House, followed by the Senate, and in the framework of an actual sort of community engagement meeting, where there's the map drawer, myself, and the community expert, which Evans is. And so we thought that might be an effective way to explain and discuss and raise issues, and put a spotlight on the tension perhaps that may exist, and be informative. And so we'll start with sharing my screen. So I am now the map drawer that has been retained by a perhaps advocacy organization, and has also organized an event or a meeting with the community experts. So those members of the community where they can provide most valuable input. Okay, all right. And so you should see my screen, which features the Pennsylvania State House, and highlighted in green is District 19. Okay, and so that is the reason for our gathering today, Minister Moore, and we're so glad that you have joined us today, and we want to share with you some data, some information, so that you can help us understand where we should focus our efforts. Our goal is to perhaps consider your feedback, your guidance, your historical knowledge, to help us understand how we should preserve this district or change this district. So I will take your input and go back to the shop and work on it. So we won't see any results today. And this is the first of many, many meetings that we expect will take place.
Thank you, Dr. Chestnut. So, did she freeze? Are you frozen, Tonya? I think Tanya's frozen. When she comes back, we will proceed. I want to take a look at 19 because those of us who know about redistricting, we know that there are two principles that you're supposed to follow: contiguousness and compactness. District 19 is neither of those. If you know anything about Pittsburgh's topography, you'll know that this district actually spans the river. However, it is necessary for us to have a district of that nature. She'll sign back in, I'm sure. To have a district of that nature, because you back with us, Tonya? Go ahead, put your screen back up.
Okay, so even though Google went through, I am located in Charlotte, even though Google went through and laid down fiber optics, we still have some delays when we're trying to hold a virtual meeting. So my apologies. So what I am showing to you, Minister Moore, as the expert community member here at this meeting, is I'm actually showing you outlined in green here, House District 19, which includes your community. And if you can tell us about your community and what's important to members of your community, please.
So here in the Hill District, we are really dealing with a multiplicity of issues. There is significant gentrification occurring where residents are being pushed out, being driven by current development patterns. There are issues around public safety and the way our community is being policed. There are issues with education in the way that our schools are performing, and also as well as access to affordable housing. It seems like affordable housing is diminishing in our community. So those are just a few of our concerns here.
Thank you. I'll certainly make a note of that because that's important to understand what exactly are those concerns, and especially in terms of increasing your participation, increasing the participation of the Hill District community, and perhaps electing a candidate of your choice. So what you see here on this map are precinct numbers. And so this is data that we used in order to identify areas that we may change, okay? And so what we do know is that we have to have equal population in all districts so that every vote counts. One vote, one person, one vote. And so what we have here in the upper left-hand corner, this negative number, it refers to the number of people that this district is short in order to meet the target ideal population.
Does that say 5,000?
Yes, yes, yes. So we are short nearly 6,000 people to make this district equal in population, or nearly equal compared to all the other districts. So that is a guideline that we must adhere to. And that makes it a little more complicated, right? So we also know, and this is what's indicated here, these numbers followed by the letter V. So these are voting population numbers. The top number represents white voting population, and the number before that represents Black voting population, okay? So that's the actual count. So when we are trying to look for where we're going to find almost 6,000 people, because this district is short population. So where would we look? So these numbers help guide us as a map drawer, but you will help guide us also in terms of what other adjacent areas that you're familiar with, other communities that are adjacent that actually share similar concerns as you've expressed.
So I have a little bit of a concern because recently I've learned that this district has lost some of its Black population, where we used to be, I believe we used to be a majority Black voting district. I believe we're down to about 42 or 43% now. And so the neighborhoods surrounding us, it's going to be hard for us to draw from those communities and still be able to elect someone who will represent us well.
Do you have any questions about the data? Do you have any questions about what we're attempting to do, other than your concerns about adjoining neighborhoods that may not share the same interest?
No questions. I've been through a couple of trainings with fair districts, so I'm kind of familiar with the data, and so I'm a little comfortable with it. I think we can have a pretty good conversation at this point.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to zoom out, and then perhaps you can assist with what areas do you think, because I am inclined to go to those areas that have larger populations that do not necessarily represent areas that are short of population, but have extra people. And so is that a good strategy? Or so I might go west of the Hill District to see what districts are have extra population, and that then I can move into adjacent districts and moving towards District 19. Do you think that's a decent strategy, or would you like for me to look at other areas perhaps?
What communities, I'm trying to look at your map, what community is that, like right to the west? Not in the city, but in that first ring of suburbs. That's to the east. That's Penn Hills and Wilkinsburg and Swissville in that area.
Okay, are we west? Are we, guide me as to where you want to look.
I would go the patterns for Pittsburgh, most of the Black population tends to migrate east and into the east suburbs.
Okay, so I've just added an overlay of the Black population. And so would you consider these areas?
I would consider those areas, yes.
Okay, all right, so that's great. So this is an example of the kind of discussion that hopefully a map drawer will have with a community member that knows communities on the ground, is very familiar with their own particular community and what their needs are, and perhaps can identify adjacent or proximate districts that may also have communities within them that also share similar concerns. And so that is an example of how you would strategize to preserve perhaps District 19. And we will now move into the Senate District.
Tonya, really quickly, before you move on, I just wanted to kind of finish something that I started saying when you were logging back on. So the way that District 19 looks is not really in accordance with contiguousness and compactness. And the reason that is because though that was intentionally drawn in a way to preserve a community of color, right? And a disbursement pattern as a result of some of the some earlier policy decisions. So there may be some instances, and I know there's talk about Pittsburgh not necessarily needing majority districts, or not being careful about the House districts because we just elected a Black mayor. But there's two things. Number one, municipal politics and legislative politics are two different processes. And number two, there was a perfect storm around that mayoral race that led to the election or the nomination of Ed Gainey, and that was what some would say is poor behavior in decision-making on the part of the current mayor, and the coalescing of a very large and powerful progressive organization with the African-American community. That might not tend to play out in legislative politics. And so if you're engaged in this process and you're thinking about maps for this particular region, you might want to keep those things in mind. Tonya.
Thank you, Evans.
Let me go back to share my screen. All right. Are we going to do, Tonya, are we going to do the Senate district?
Do we have time, Carol? You're on mute. You're on mute.
If you could do it quickly, I think we'd love to see it, but it would need to be quick. Yep.
Okay, it'll be quick.
Yep.
All right. Okay.
All right, I quit sharing my screen, Tonya.
Okay, thank you. Okay, all right, so we see here Senate District number 42. I guess you can describe that shape any number of ways. I won't attempt to do so now, but this, Minister Evans, is the district that we invited you to this meeting to discuss. And so we do know that presently that district has over maybe around 600 in the district. And so it's fairly close to the equal population. Do we really need to actually make any changes to this, or do we want to look for other areas that may need part of this population? Now, due to your community's particular interest, we do understand, though, that this voting age population in this district is only 19%. And so is it in the community's interest really to try to find coalition partners, such as maybe other communities, other minority communities in particular, that may form if we add them or remove some other parts of this district and then add perhaps other areas that may represent other groups that you may work in coalition with to perform better and have a say, have a stronger impact in what candidates are elected?
Yes, we've never, in my lifetime, I've never had a state senator of color represent my community or folks that are faced with the issues that we're faced with. And I think we can, I think we should look for opportunities to increase the Black voting age population percentage in the Senate district. I think we can get at that. I don't think we have to have a majority minority district to do that. I think if we get up into, you know, somewhere between the 42 or the 40 to 45% range, we should be able to maybe at least wade into the conversation to be able to elect someone of our choice as Black voters.
Okay. And so what I've done here is overlaid the Black population. And so that may give us an idea of how we should strategize and what areas we should focus to perhaps shift this district and change this district. So that concludes our little role play. I hope it was informative and instructive. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for kind of calling attention to some of the different issues and some of the different dialogues that might take place as we look at maps, as we think about communities, and as we look at the history of those communities. So thank you both for sharing with us. We're going to move to the last section of our evening, and that is going to be to turn our attention to Philly and to the Latino communities of Philly. So we have with us this evening Will Gonzalez. He is the executive director of CEIBA, the largest coalition of Latino community-based organizations in Philadelphia. I was going to tell you about the tree that it's named for, but I'm going to skip that, even though I love that little piece of history in their work. Mr. Gonzalez is the past president of the Hispanic Bar Association of Pennsylvania, and he's a member of the board of the PA chapter of the ACLU, and certainly has been very active in the Latino community in Philadelphia.
Thank you.
And shall I introduce Marcos, or you'll do that yourself? Two others who will be part of this conversation. I'll introduce you all, and then how you divide up your time is up to you. Marcos Lomeli is also part of CEIBA. He is a program director and a community organizer in the Latino community, and he's pursuing a degree in political science at Temple University. And they'll be joined as part of this conversation by Anthony Solis Cruz. He's the Southeastern Regional Coordinator for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He has experience organizing and training in other states and is working with MALDEF to expand their support of the Latino community in Pennsylvania as we go through this round of redistricting. So, Will, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure you'll hand off to the others as you see fit, but I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate sharing in this great informative session, and for all the work that your group has been doing over the last few years and this very important matter. We want to highlight communities of interest. We want to highlight, again, that's a neutral term. I know Mr. Geffen and Mr. Fowler talked about, how this Supreme Court could be sensitive as to what type of labeling we use. So communities of interest is a neutral term. I think a lot, and that specifically applies to the Latino community. There have been some folks trying to bastardize what communities of interest mean, but communities of interest is rather simple. It's not just every Eagles fan or every Pittsburgh Steelers fan or Pirates or Phillies. It's more to that. It's taking into account things that make a group of people to be a community, collective interests, share things in common, customs, arts, social institutions, achievements, challenges. And so we're focusing on the prioritization of communities of interest in redistricting in Pennsylvania. We wanted them to take into account the streets, neighborhoods, important hubs that make the communities unique. We see that in the Latino communities, to consider landmarks, districts, cultural districts, commercial districts, employers, where kids go to school, where families go to church, location of neighborhood-based and social service organizations. So in Philadelphia, that's rather simple because although Hispanics live in all parts of Philadelphia, they're concentrated in mostly two parts. I'll talk about the Eastern North Philadelphia part, which is the largest part. My colleague Marcos Lomeli will talk about the developing, emerging Hispanic community in South Philadelphia. It's grown so much that what used to be, well, still called somewhat the Italian market is now called the Latino Asian market among the newer members of the Philadelphia community. And so, again, the Eastern North Philadelphia Latino community epitomizes a definition of communities of interest. We share bilingual, bicultural characteristics, culturally linguistically appropriate nonprofit, churches, schools, business corridors, social institutions, and we are in a compact urban footprint without geographic barriers. And I know talking about Eastern North Philadelphia is easier than talking about maybe some of the in other parts of the state when you look at Berks County and Reading and et cetera. Also when you talk difference in talking about congressional district, U.S. congressional districts versus state Senate districts or state House districts. In our case, city council and other things. And so how do you put communities of interest? Should Allentown, Bethlehem be together in one congressional district? How do you do that? But I'm going to focus on Philadelphia. I also, want to make sure that we recognize the growth of the Latino community and what it's meant for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for the city of Philadelphia. The growth in the Hispanic population far outpaced out of the whole state. and offset the declines in population of other groups in the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania's population it generally only grew 2.4% between 2010 and 2020, or about 300,000 people. During that same period, Pennsylvania's Hispanic population grew 45.8%, or about 330,000 people. In other words, the Latino community share of total population change in Pennsylvania was 110%. We were responsible for 110% of that 2.4% growth. But for the Latino community, Pennsylvania would have lost another congressional district. In Philadelphia, the city's population growth was also fueled by the expansion of the Latino community. The total population of the city grew 5%, or about 77,791 people between 2010 and 2020. And during that same period, the Hispanic population in Philadelphia grew 27%. So again, we played an important role. There is a pretty neat site, and I'll put that in the chat, where you can see by county how that Latino growth took place. I know it's an ABC local website, but I thought that it was an easy to use tool to see that growth in the Hispanic community. We also think that it's very important for the economy of Pennsylvania and of Philadelphia that we maximize the opportunity for Hispanics to be, their communities of interest to be intact within districts. In Philadelphia's Eastern North Philadelphia community, for example, we can fit cozily in one congressional district, one senatorial district. You can easily give us 3-4 state legislative districts, and in one councilmanic district. So I know that the geography there is a lot easier. I think Marcos will talk a little bit about what's happening in South Philadelphia, where that community right now is being divided, that Hispanic community. But I also wanted to highlight the importance of the Latino community economically, and then using Philadelphia as an example. We did a study in 2018 with the help of students from the University of Pennsylvania's Masters of City Planning. And we looked at just at the nonprofits. 15 Latino nonprofits leveraged $86 million in government grants to sustain 4,160 local jobs, generate $222 million in wages and salaries, build 1,333 new homes, and rehab nearly 10,000 housing units. While the full benefits of these investments are incalculable, they're collectively worth at least $517 million per year. And that's just from looking at 2018 data. Obviously, the community has increased and its impact has increased. But those 15 nonprofits during that year transformed the social and physical landscape for 124,000 households and 1,900 businesses in Philadelphia. We hope to run another study of what that impact is. But I wanted to give some more time for Marcos to talk about what's happening in South Philadelphia and that emerging Latino community, and also to have my colleague, Tony Solis Cruz from MALDEF, also talk about what he's seeing, not only in Pennsylvania, but nationally. Thank you very much. And we'd be glad to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Will, and good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate you guys for inviting us, and everyone who's still in the audience who's hung with us for a good long while now. We think this is an important matter, and I do want to take a couple of minutes, as Will mentioned, to talk about the Latino community in South Philly and its possible role in the redistricting process. I'm going to try to share my screen. Give me just a moment, and I swear I won't be too long. Give me a thumbs up if my screen is showing. Yes, thank you. Now let's see here. So when we're talking about redistricting in South Philly, as Will mentioned, obviously the Latino community has, I won't belabor the point, but we've grown exponentially since the 90s. The city of, across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, of course, we feel we represented more than the total growth in population. In the city of Philadelphia specifically, and if you go to that link that Will shared in the chat, you'll be able to see it. Since 2000, the Latino population in Philadelphia nearly tripled. And we're going to look at one of the principal areas where that transformation in population has taken place. We're looking at South Philly. These are some graphics that I pulled from this self-organized group of mostly Mexican, although we're talking about a rich environment of many different cultures and languages and ethnical backgrounds in South Philadelphia. But I didn't want to speak for them. I just took their words for it. Mexican community, more recently the Central American community, have been an established part of the South Philly region since the 90s. The area has continued to grow in population. And we're very proud, me personally, as a part of the Latino community, the South Philly Mexican community, very proud of the 9th Street commercial corridor that we've built in partnership with obviously the communities that lived here before us. Again, this is a quick little map of, and this is just to give you an example of the South 9th Street corridor. And then I'll show you what it looks like on a larger map in a moment. But obviously we're looking north over here. This is flipped 90 degrees, so north to south. We're talking about more than 40 businesses just along that 9th Street corridor, and obviously spilling out into the general neighborhood around it. So you can see here a broader map of South Philadelphia with this red arrow sort of pointing from the northernmost, let's say like Latino-led business all the way to the southernmost. And you can see this blue dot here is actually where my old house is. So I know a little bit about the neighborhood, and especially the diversity of industry there. We're talking about restaurants, convenience stores, radio stations, grocery stores, beauty salons, beauty parlors, produce markets, all kinds of different businesses that have sprung up in this district in the last 30 years, in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years especially. And currently this area of South Philly is bisected at both the federal congressional level and the state congressional level. Here's the state house. We can see District 182 and District 184 divide. You can see this very thin arrow here. I apologize for my PowerPoint skills, but this street here that divides the two districts is just Tasker Street, Wharton Street. Anybody who lives in South Philly or has been around South Philly knows it's just a regular street. So perhaps our opinion, it doesn't seem very fair that the district or the community is divided just randomly by the street. You have people who are neighbors, co-workers who maybe live on one side, work on another side. Doesn't really reflect the reality of this community. Similar phenomenon you can see happening here in at the federal congressional level. The 3rd district and the 5th district bisecting the corridor at a different point. This time further down around Dickinson Street, if I'm not mistaken. No, that might be Mifflin Street. Anyway, these are just regular South Philly streets, not really any considerable geographic barrier there. And they're neighborhoods that are obviously interconnected. When we're talking about this commercial corridor along South 9th Street, we're not just talking about those shops along those storefronts along that street. We're obviously talking about a broader, rich environment of not just Latino, but many different immigrant communities, limited English proficient communities that have, similar to in North Philadelphia, a strong network of schools, churches, libraries, businesses, housing units, et cetera, that really bind these communities together. So over the past few weeks, few months, few years, obviously, we've been trying to encourage community participation in this redistricting process. I feel like Will's really been running me ragged. All of 2020, it was census. Now 2021, it's redistricting. But that's the nature of the game.
But they're related, they are still really related.
Yeah, that's part of the challenge. But we've been trying to organize, and Tony, I'm sure, can talk a little bit about this too, with the existing groups of Latino merchants. For example, this Mexican market, there's a local radio station. This is all self-organized, so they don't need us to bring them together. They're self-organized. They're brought together. They're motivated. They're interested in this process, and now it's just a matter of getting them in the door, whether in any way that we can as a community-based organizations, whether that's testifying at various congressional hearings or other tactics that you all know very well, I'm sure. So that's a quick summary of what's going on in South Philly. Obviously happy to take any questions, but also pass the mic to my good friend Tony Solis.
Hey everyone, Carol, thank you so much for hosting the space for us, and thank you to the panelists for the amazing information shared previously. I'm going to go very quickly, and I'm entering the space as a former teacher, so I'm very good at adjusting on the fly, and we'll skip stuff as needed. So if you see something that you really wanted to learn more of, always open to questions at the end. And my students would sometimes say, if you get too excited, you talk too fast. So if that's the case, somebody tell me to slow down. But thank you for having me in this space. I'm going to go ahead and briefly skip over some of this stuff. Something that's really important for the community members here, just a brief reintroduction of what redistricting actually is. It is redrawing of political boundaries. And I like to tell my Latino community all the times is to think of redistricting as a pastel de tres leches, a tres leches cake, a 3 milk cake. I don't even know if that actually translates in its actual meaning and its actual deliciousness. But as we are talking about redistricting, we are talking about dividing up communities and dividing up different jurisdictions within the state. I like to tell people that I'm a hungry person and I know what kind of cake that I like, right? So if I'm going to be going to this party and someone's going to be offering me cake, I want to have a slice of cake that includes an entire peach, right? I don't want to have half a peach. I don't want to have half a strawberry. I want the entity of the fruit to stay intact. So that's the same thing with communities of interest. And as we talk about redistricting specifically for people of color, right? As we advocate for communities of color, we want to make sure that we are advocating for them to receive the appropriate slice of cake and a slice of cake that it involves all of them, that they become a full peach or a full strawberry. And everyone is included in this process. Participants, I'm not sure if any of you all are undocumented or afraid to engage with the government in any way, shape, or form due to being Latino or a person of color, more generally speaking. But just know that everyone is involved in this process regardless of your documentation status. So you, as a person who doesn't speak English or as a person who isn't a citizen, can directly testify, give testimony, and talk about your community specifically and what binds you and your community and why you deserve to be together as we're talking about redistricting. We'll mention some statistics amazingly, right? And here they are in the flesh. Here are the numbers in front of you. And I like these numbers because, I mean, again, former math teacher, this always excites me to look at these numbers. Not only did Latinos grow by 45.8% within the 2010 to 2020 census, but we also were the sole reason for prohibiting the population decline in the entire state. So not only did we grow as a community, we also covered the deficit in population growth for the entire state. And that's something that I truly, truly want to repeat and emphasize, especially for the Latino participants out there, to know that we are becoming a more prominent community, not just in Philly and in Pennsylvania, but across the country. In all of the US, we accounted for 51.1% of the entire growth in the US. So again, those are very important statistics, and Pennsylvania is one of only a handful of states who now has more than 1 million different Latinos. I want to take a few minutes to look at these maps. I hope they're not too small here, but this one in particular is extremely important for the Latino community. Currently, the Latino citizen voting age population is at 29.72% within a deviation that fits the criteria within redistricting. But if you see kind of like the edges here, right, and this is exactly the area that Will was talking about Northeast Philly, right? You see that there's a prominent amount of Latinos outside. The red markings on this map identify the Latinos, green markings identify the Black community, the yellow ones identify the white community, blue is the Asian community. Okay, so again, you can see that within Senate District 2, not only does it go all the way up here and all the way over here, right? But you also see that there's a good chunk of Latinos that are kind of being divided, right? They are not if we're bringing back to the metaphor about cake, we're talking about the strawberry being split up here. We're talking about the peach being split up, right? We want that slice of cake to encompass the entire fruit. We want this redistricting process to encompass all of the entire community of interest here, in this case, the Latino community, right? So anyway, I just wanted to highlight Senate District 2 in that regard, and that it may be possible to create a Latino specific district there, and we currently don't have any senators, and in fact we only have 4 elected representatives in the state of Pennsylvania, which is again an astounding number that does not at all match the statistics that were shared by Will and the statistics that I shared with you earlier. Here's another map that I wanted to show you all, Senate District 11. Right, so you can see that there's a good chunk of minority folks. So like, again, using the term here, there's a bunch of BIPOC folks here, right? In which you can see that effectively this area here, if it was shifted over to this side, you effectively bring these communities of color together to potentially create an influence district, a coalition district. But again, just wanted to highlight that sometimes with mapping, there are opportunities to bring coalition districts together, but they're not always kind of brought together. And here you see that this district is actually over the deviation, and it has 21.38% of Latino citizen voting age population. The reason I keep emphasizing Latino citizen voting age population is because as the previously was mentioned with the Voting Rights Act Section 2, a Section 2 district only considers only considers citizens, right? It only considers people who are actually able to vote. So unfortunately, in that process, undocumented folks and non-citizens would not be included in the legal aspect of a Section 2 district. Here's another one here, right? When we see that it's incredibly split here, and of course not by accident, right? So you see a bunch of Latinos over on this side on Senate District 18, and you see them being separated from the Latinos in Allentown in District 16. Everyone talked about this, so of course re-emphasizing the community of interest talk, and the fact that like this process is incredibly important, not only because it only happens every 10 years, right? Imagine yourself 10 years ago. Imagine yourself 10 years from now. That is the magnitude of this specific process that only happens every 10 years. And it directly impacts the funding that we receive as a community. Again, I always like to remind folks that, I mean, when I was a teacher, this is not far from the building I was teaching in. I was teaching mostly Black and brown students. My classroom was a trailer. I had no technology, and the first time I entered, I didn't have AC or heating. The internet and electricity were out. There was no teacher's desk. All I had was a chalkboard and chalk. And so that's incredibly important to share so that people understand that this process is extremely consequential, because it effectively will define the way in which we are heard as a community. And yep, and then that's another map of Philly if the folks wanted to take another look at what Marcos was talking about down here and what Will was talking about over here. Thank you all. I hope I didn't go too fast, and I hope I didn't take too much of your time. I know time is precious.
No, you did not take too much of our time. That was really terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much for that really good insight. Thank you, Will and Marcos as well for your portrait of what's happening in Philly in the Latino community. I wish we had another hour, because I think there's lots that we could discuss. I want to say this is the start. It's not the start. It's part of an ongoing really important conversation. I feel like Fair Districts folks, we just keep learning, and the more we learn, the more we realize we need to learn. We talk to new people, and then we realize we need to talk to more people. And we are in the process right now of holding what we are calling community mapping conversations. And we would love anybody who is here who has not been part of a community mapping conversation, please join us in that. There are a couple of ways you could do that. And I think that Amy put something in chat. Let me see what she put. Yeah, so she put a request a speaker. You can request a speaker to come do a mapping conversation. And what would happen is we would have, we have Fair Districts mappers, but I would love to include Tonya Farrow Chestnut and Solis Cruz if they are interested and available to be part of a mapping conversation in a place where this BIPOC communities are Black and Brown communities are part of this, to make sure that we are thinking carefully about who is being best represented. And I know that they are busy people, but we would do our best to include them. We also have folks who won our own Fair Districts mapping competition who want to hear from communities, because we are creating some maps that we will submit as testimony. There was a question about, wouldn't it be best to start with blank slate maps? Yes, of course. The maps we have now are terrible. They do not represent communities well. They have been distorted over the past decades as population has shifted. The districts have been tweaked to maintain incumbent protection, to maintain partisan control. The districts are, as you can look at our House and Senate maps and see, they are very, very bad. The likelihood of our Legislative Reapportionment Commission starting with blank maps is about 0, since 4 of the 5 commissioners are leaders of their caucuses. And answer to their caucus who want the cores of their districts maintained. But there is possibility of real shifting of those districts, and it is going to be the case that there are going to have to be a few districts that move from one side of the state to the other. There's no way to adjust for our population shifts by tweaking and twisting and trying to manipulate. Senate maps, yes, that's possible, because Senate maps are fairly, the Senate districts are large and malleable and can possibly make that happen. House districts, not at all. And we would love to advocate strongly for a Latino Senate district in that Hunting Park, Kensington area that Tony showed us. We would also love to advocate for a majority minority Black Senate district, or as close as possible in the Pittsburgh area. So we want to continue in conversation. You can request a speaker to do a mapping conversation. This is an important issue for us. And also you could give testimony. We're going to send it, as I said, we will send an email to everybody who registered with links. So those are our guests. If you would like to share your contact information, we'll put that in the email. If you would like to share your upcoming events, we'll put that in the email. If you have training or other things, we'll share that. We'll also share links to our own. We have a video that does some training on giving testimony. We have a page that offers links to all the there's different ways to give testimony, whether it's congressional or legislative. We have links to that. We will do our best to get as much information out to everybody as we can. And please continue to lean in. The more we lean in, the more possible it is that we get maps that really do represent everybody. And Tony, I love your example of the cake. We will we'll be asking you for that slide, because that really captures the idea of communities of interest really well. You don't even get the flavor when you cut it the wrong way. And that's what's happened to Pennsylvania across the state. We've been cut the wrong way so that nobody's flavor comes through. And we want a legislative process where everybody's flavor comes through, is heard, is considered, where every voice has a part. So thank you all. I'm going to end recording here. If anybody wants to stay and linger and ask a few more questions in chat, if our guests are willing to do that, we can do that. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Really appreciate everybody giving their time to this topic.